Nathan Carter sat near the window of his 6th grade classroom at Lincoln Academy, his fingers lightly drumming against the worn wooden desk. It wasn't a nervous habit, just something he did when he was deep in thought. The midday sun poured through the tall windows, casting golden streaks across the room. Outside, the early autumn air was crisp, leaves beginning to turn shades of amber and red, drifting lazily across the schoolyard. Nathan was a quiet, observant boy, never one to cause trouble. At just 11 years old, he already carried himself with a quiet confidence that many mistook for shyness. He had learned early on that sometimes, it was easier to stay in the background than to force himself into a space where he wasn't welcome. And in Mrs. Simmons' classroom, that space often felt narrower than it did for the other kids. Mrs. Simmons was a seasoned educator, having taught for over 20 years. She was known for being strict but, in the eyes of many, fair. However, for Nathan, fairness wasn't something he had experienced much in her class. It wasn't outright cruelty, she never yelled at him or treated him harshly in ways that others would easily notice. It was subtler than that. She rarely called on him, even when his hand was raised. When he answered correctly, she moved on quickly, without praise. But when he made even the smallest mistake, she let the moment linger, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for the other students to notice. It hadn't taken long for Nathan to understand, he was being dismissed. At Lincoln Academy, most of the students came from middle-class families. Many of them had parents who were professionals, doctors, lawyers, business owners. Nathan, on the other hand, came from a long line of musicians. His grandfather, James Jimmy Carter Sr., had been a jazz pianist, well known in their Arkansas town for playing at local clubs and community gatherings. His mother had grown up listening to the deep, soulful sounds of jazz filling their small home, and she had passed that love of music down to Nathan. But Nathan didn't talk about it much. Not because he was embarrassed, far from it. He simply knew that in a place like Lincoln Academy, people didn't see music as something to be proud of unless it was accompanied by wealth or prestige. He had learned that lesson the hard way when he once mentioned his grandfather's music to a classmate, only to be met with a dismissive, "Oh, like a bar musician," as if it was something less than honorable. That was why, when Mrs. Simmons suddenly started looking at him differently one morning, watching him more closely, as if sizing him up, Nathan felt something shift. He didn't know what it was, but he knew it wasn't good. That day, the lesson carried on as usual. But there was something in the way Mrs. Simmons glanced his way, her lips pressing into a thin line, that made Nathan's stomach tighten. He wasn't sure why, but he had the feeling that whatever was coming next, it wasn't just another ordinary school day. Nathan Carter had spent most of the school year being overlooked in Mrs. Simmons' class. He wasn't a troublemaker, nor was he the loudest student, but he always did his work thoroughly and took pride in getting things right. Despite that, Mrs. Simmons rarely acknowledged him. She had a way of making him feel invisible, not in a blatant, cruel way, but in a way that told him he wasn't someone she saw as important. That was why it surprised him when, one afternoon, she suddenly called his name. "Nathan," she said, her voice crisp and clear, cutting through the low hum of students packing up their things for the day. A few heads turned. Nathan paused, his fingers still resting on his notebook. It was rare for her to address him directly, and when she did, it usually wasn't for anything good. "Stay behind for a moment," she added, her expression unreadable. Whispers fluttered through the room as his classmates exchanged curious glances. Even Jake Patterson, one of the boys who usually teased Nathan, shot him a sideways look before shoving his books into his backpack. Nathan took his time putting away his things, watching as the last of the students filtered out. When the door finally clicked shut, he turned to face Mrs. Simmons, his hands resting on the straps of his backpack. She sat at her desk, tapping a pen idly against the wood. For a moment, she simply studied him, as if deciding how to begin. Then, she spoke. "I overheard you talking the other day," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Something about your grandfather." Nathan frowned. "What about him?" "You said he was a musician," she continued, her tone light but holding something else beneath it, something that made the air feel heavier. "Yeah," Nathan said cautiously. "He was a pianist. Played jazz." Mrs. Simmons' lips curled ever so slightly. It wasn't quite a smirk, but it wasn't a smile either. "Interesting," she mused, leaning back in her chair. "I suppose that means you must have picked up a thing or two from him." Nathan hesitated. He wasn't sure where this was going, but he didn't like the way it felt. "A little," he admitted. Her expression widened, just a fraction, but there was no warmth in it. "Good to know," she said, standing up and smoothing her skirt. "Tomorrow, I want you to play something for the class." Nathan blinked. For a moment, he thought he must have misheard her. "What?" "The piano," she said, gesturing toward the old upright sitting in the back of the classroom, the one that no one had touched in years. "You'll play for us tomorrow." Nathan felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't an invitation. It wasn't encouragement. It was something else. "Why?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. Mrs. Simmons tilted her head, as if the question amused her. "Why not?" Nathan knew that tone. It wasn't curiosity. It was a challenge. She expected him to stumble, to hesitate, to embarrass himself. His mind raced. He hadn't played in front of an audience in years, not since his grandfather had passed. Playing at home, in the quiet of his own space, was one thing. But here, in front of an entire class that never paid him much attention unless it was to make a joke at his expense, that was different. He could already picture it, Jake snickering in the background, a few students whispering, waiting for him to fail. He could feel the weight of their expectations, the way they assumed this would be just another moment where Nathan Carter proved he wasn't worth noticing. But something inside him shifted. He met Mrs. Simmons' gaze, unflinching. If she wanted a spectacle, he would give her one. "All right," he said simply. For the first time, a flicker of something crossed her expression. Was it surprise? But just as quickly, she masked it, giving him a curt nod. "Good," she said. "Tomorrow, then." Nathan slung his backpack over his shoulder and turned toward the door, his heart pounding, not from fear, but from something else. Determination. Because if Mrs. Simmons wanted to put him on display, she was about to get a performance she would never forget. That night, Nathan Carter lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The dim glow of the street lamp outside his window cast soft shadows across his small room, flickering slightly whenever a car passed by. Normally, the gentle hum of nighttime traffic lulled him to sleep, but tonight, his mind wouldn't settle. The challenge from Mrs. Simmons replayed in his head over and over again. "Tomorrow, I want you to play something for the class." She hadn't said it with kindness. She hadn't said it as an invitation. It had been a setup. He knew it. Nathan turned onto his side, his fingers twitching slightly as if already searching for the piano keys. His grandfather, James Jimmy Carter Sr., had once told him that a true musician could feel the notes long before they ever touched an instrument. "Before you play, boy, you gotta hear it in your bones." He had heard those words so many times before, sitting on the worn leather bench next to his grandfather in their living room, the air thick with the scent of black coffee and old vinyl records. The upright piano had stood proudly in the corner, its rich, warm tones filling the house on Sunday afternoons when Jimmy Carter Sr. would sit down and let his fingers tell a story. Music ain't just notes. It's the way you make folks feel. It's what you say when words ain't enough. Nathan swallowed hard, closing his eyes. He could still picture his grandfather's hands, weathered but steady, gliding effortlessly over the keys, coaxing out melodies that could make a person laugh, cry, or simply close their eyes and sway with the rhythm. He missed him. His grandfather had passed away 2 years ago, and since then, Nathan had barely played for anyone. It wasn't that he couldn't, it was that it never felt the same without his grandfather there to nod in approval, to tap his foot in time with the music. Playing had been something special between them. Something private. And now, Mrs. Simmons wanted to turn it into a spectacle. Nathan exhaled slowly, shifting onto his back again. He wasn't afraid of playing. That wasn't the problem. He knew he was good, better than good. But he also knew why Mrs. Simmons had chosen him, out of all the kids in class, to do this. She thought he would stumble. She thought he would crack under pressure. She thought she could prove something. Nathan clenched his jaw, gripping the blanket between his fingers. He didn't like being underestimated, but he wasn't just going to prove her wrong. He was going to make her regret ever trying to set him up in the first place. Pushing back the covers, he slipped out of bed and padded quietly to the other side of the room, where his old Yamaha keyboard sat on a small wooden stand. It wasn't much, nowhere near the quality of his grandfather's upright, but it was enough. He plugged in the power, adjusting the volume low enough so that it wouldn't wake his mother in the next room. He sat down, placing his fingers lightly over the keys. For a moment, he just breathed. Then, he played. A slow, rolling blues progression filled the quiet room, soft but deliberate. His fingers moved instinctively, muscle memory guiding them as he lost himself in the music. He closed his eyes, letting the weight of the day slip away with each note. The nervousness, the doubt, the anger, it all melted into the melody. Nathan wasn't playing for Mrs. Simmons. He wasn't even playing for his classmates. He was playing for himself. By the time he finally stopped, the room felt different. Lighter. He exhaled, flexing his fingers before standing up and switching off the keyboard. Tomorrow, he would walk into that classroom, sit down at that old, out-of-tune piano, and he would play. Not because she asked him to, but because he had something to say. And when he did, he would make sure they all listened. The next morning, Nathan Carter walked into class with a calmness that even surprised him. The usual hum of students settling into their seats filled the air, but there was an undercurrent of anticipation rippling through the room. Everyone had heard about it by now. "You really gonna play today?" Jake Patterson smirked from his desk near the back. His voice carried just enough amusement to suggest he expected Nathan to embarrass himself. Nathan didn't answer. He didn't need to. Instead, he set his notebook down and took his seat, letting the noise around him fade into the background. His fingers absent-mindedly tapped against the wooden desk, light, rhythmic, almost like the soft roll of a snare drum. His grandfather used to say that music started in the hands before it reached the instrument. Mrs. Simmons, standing at the front of the room, finally spoke. "All right, before we begin today's lesson, let's take a moment for something special." The way she said it, just a little too sweet, a little too forced, made Nathan's stomach tighten. She turned toward him. "Nathan, why don't you come up and show us what you can do?" A few students chuckled under their breath. Someone whispered something, but Nathan didn't try to hear it. He pushed his chair back and stood up. As he walked toward the old upright piano in the back corner of the room, he could feel every eye on him. The piano itself was nothing special: scratched wood, yellowed keys, slightly out of tune. It had probably been sitting there for years, collecting dust, more of a decoration than a real instrument. Nathan took a deep breath and sat down, placing his fingers lightly on the keys. Then, just for a moment, he let everything else disappear. He started slow, soft, deliberate, letting the first notes settle over the classroom. A simple blues progression, steady and sure. His left hand held the rhythm, his right hand finding the melody, weaving through the keys like it had done 100 times before in his grandfather's living room. The chuckles stopped. The whispers faded. The sound filled the room, rich and full, carrying more weight than anyone had expected. Nathan's fingers moved faster now, building, shaping the music into something alive. He wasn't just playing notes, he was telling a story. He let the melody swell, shifting effortlessly into a cascading run up the keyboard, his hands gliding with practiced ease. It wasn't just skill. It was feeling. And the class felt it. Jake, who had been smirking earlier, now sat frozen, his mouth slightly open. Emma, who sat near the front, leaned forward, eyes wide. Even Tyler, the kid who barely paid attention to anything that wasn't football, was staring. Mrs. Simmons, however, was the most silent of all. Nathan didn't look at her. He didn't need to. He could feel it in the air, the shift, the weight of realization settling over the room. He wasn't the quiet kid they could ignore. He wasn't just some student they barely noticed. He was more than what they had assumed. The music rose again, one last powerful run, the chords ringing through the classroom like a statement, clear, undeniable. Then, silence. For a long moment, no one moved. The air was thick, heavy with something unspoken. Then, from the back of the room, a single clap. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the entire class was applauding. Some students looked at each other in disbelief, shaking their heads like they couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. Jake let out a low whistle. Damn. Even Tyler, still staring, muttered, "I didn't know he could do that." Nathan exhaled slowly, his hands resting on his lap. His heart wasn't racing, not from nerves, at least. It was something else. Something stronger. He had done more than play. He had been heard. The applause filled the room. But Mrs. Simmons? She hadn't moved. Her arms were crossed, her expression unreadable. The class was looking at her now, waiting for her to say something. Finally, she spoke. "Well," she said, her voice clipped. "That was unexpected." The applause faded. A few students glanced at each other, as if realizing how quickly she was trying to move past what had just happened. Nathan didn't smile. He didn't need to. Because he knew, they all knew, that after today, Mrs. Simmons would never be able to ignore him again. For a long moment after the final note faded, the classroom remained utterly silent. The kind of silence that wasn't just quiet, but heavy, charged with something unspoken. Nathan Carter sat at the old, worn piano, his hands resting lightly on the keys, his heart steady. He wasn't nervous anymore. He had played for himself, not for them, not for Mrs. Simmons. And that had made all the difference. Then, from the back of the room, a single clap. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the classroom erupted into applause, students looking at one another in disbelief, as if they had just witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. Jake Patterson, who had been smirking earlier, leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. Emma Collins, the quietest girl in the class, had her hands clasped together, staring at Nathan like she had just discovered something brand new about him. "Damn," Tyler Matthews muttered under his breath, still staring at the piano. I didn't know he could do that. Nathan exhaled slowly, feeling the energy in the room shift. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, at least not like this. But for once, it didn't feel like a joke at his expense. It felt different. And then, there was Mrs. Simmons. She hadn't moved. She still stood near her desk, arms crossed over her chest, lips pressed tightly together. Her usual air of authority, the quiet control she held over the room, felt thinner now, cracked, like a window pane hit by a stray baseball. Nathan finally looked at her. She met his gaze, and for a brief moment, he saw it, something flickering behind her carefully composed expression. Surprise? Discomfort? Maybe even regret? Whatever it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Mrs. Simmons cleared her throat. Well, she said, her voice clipped, that was unexpected. The applause slowly died down, students glancing between her and Nathan, sensing that she wasn't about to celebrate this moment the way they were. Nathan studied her. He had known from the moment she challenged him that she hadn't expected much. Maybe she thought he would stumble over a few notes, maybe she thought he didn't actually know how to play. But she certainly hadn't expected this. A beat of silence stretched between them before she spoke again. Where did you learn to play like that? Her tone was even, but there was something behind it, something measured. Nathan didn't look away. My grandfather, he said simply. Something flickered across her face again, but it was gone too quickly to name. Mrs. Simmons straightened. I see. For a second, she seemed to consider her next words carefully, but instead of acknowledging what had just happened, she turned back to the class, her voice returning to its usual firm tone. All right, let's get back to our lesson. But nobody moved. A few students exchanged glances. Brandon Taylor, the loudmouth of the class, let out an incredulous laugh. That's it? Mrs. Simmons' sharp eyes snapped to him. Excuse me? Brandon shrugged. I mean, that's all you're gonna say? He just played like something out of a movie, and we're just gonna move on. Several students nodded in agreement, murmuring quietly. Mrs. Simmons' mouth tightened. This is a classroom, not a talent show, she said briskly. Nathan sat still, watching her. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. He had expected this. But for the first time, she knew that he had seen through her. And so did the rest of the class. Nathan exhaled, rolling his shoulders back as he stood up from the piano bench and walked back to his seat. The weight of every step felt different now, not heavy, but stronger. As he slid into his chair, Tyler gave him a slow, approving nod. Emma, still watching him, whispered, "That was amazing." And across the room, for the first time all year, Nathan wasn't invisible. Mrs. Simmons may have tried to move on. But Nathan knew, sooner or later, she would have to reckon with what had just happened. And for the first time, he was in control of the room, not her. Nathan Carter had never been the type to challenge authority. He had spent most of his life knowing when to stay quiet, when to keep his head down. But today was different. As he settled back into his seat after his performance, the classroom still buzzed with the energy of what had just happened. Students whispered, some stealing glances at him, others watching Mrs. Simmons, waiting to see how she would respond. But Mrs. Simmons, ever composed, simply adjusted the papers on her desk and cleared her throat. All right, let's move on, she said, her voice crisp and businesslike. For a second, it seemed like that was the end of it. Like she thought she could just brush past what had just unfolded. But Brandon Taylor, the boldest kid in class, wasn't having it. he scoffed, shaking his head. That's it? Mrs. Simmons' sharp gaze snapped to him. Excuse me? Brandon leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. I mean, that's all you're gonna say? Nathan just played like something off a jazz record, and you're just gonna act like it didn't happen? A few students murmured in agreement. Emma Collins, normally quiet, nodded. Tyler Matthews, who had never been particularly interested in school, sat forward slightly, watching the exchange unfold. Nathan could feel the weight of their eyes on him. He wasn't used to this, people looking at him like he mattered. But what really held his attention was Mrs. Simmons' reaction. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her desk. Her control over the room was slipping. Nathan let the moment stretch just a little longer before speaking. You didn't think I could play, did you? His voice was steady, calm. Not accusing. Just stating a fact. Mrs. Simmons' expression didn't change, but her jaw tensed. I simply gave you an opportunity to share your talent with the class, she said evenly. Nathan shook his head. No, he said, his voice firmer now. You thought I'd mess up. That's why you asked me. A ripple went through the class. Mrs. Simmons' fingers curled slightly against her desk. That's enough, Nathan. But he wasn't finished. You wouldn't have asked Jake to play, he continued, glancing toward the boy who had been smirking earlier but now sat frozen, watching the exchange unfold. Or Tyler. Or Brandon. But you asked me. Silence. Mrs. Simmons' eyes darkened. You are out of line, she said, her voice clipped, controlled. Nathan met her gaze, unflinching. I don't think I am. More whispers filled the room. For the first time, Nathan wasn't the one feeling small. Mrs. Simmons was. The tension in the room thickened. For a second, it seemed like she might say something real, something honest. But then, just as quickly, she forced herself back into control. Her posture straightened. Sit down, she ordered. For the first time all year, Nathan didn't immediately do as he was told. He looked around the room, at his classmates, at the ones who had ignored him before, at the ones who had underestimated him, at the ones who had smirked when Mrs. Simmons called his name. Then, finally, he stood up from his seat, not out of defiance, but out of strength. The silence in the room felt different now. It wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't oppressive. It was charged. And Mrs. Simmons, for all her years of authority, for all the control she usually had over her classroom, looked just a little bit shaken. Finally, Nathan sat down. But this time, he wasn't sitting down because she told him to. He was sitting down because he chose to. Mrs. Simmons turned away, flipping open her lesson plan as if she could pretend nothing had happened. Let's move on, she said, her voice brisk. But the room didn't shift back to normal as quickly as she had expected. The energy lingered. People whispered. Brandon muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Weird how you don't want to talk about it now. Mrs. Simmons' eyes snapped up, sharp and assessing. That's enough, she said. But the cracks were already showing. For the rest of the class, Mrs. Simmons still ran her lesson, still spoke in the same authoritative tone. But something was different. Her words didn't land with the same weight they usually did. The students weren't as engaged. She had lost something today. And Nathan? Nathan had gained something. By the time the bell rang and students began packing up their things, Nathan slung his bag over his shoulder and walked toward the door. Just as he reached it, Mrs. Simmons spoke again. Nathan. He paused, turning back to face her. For a moment, She looked like she might say something meaningful. Something real. But then, her expression hardened. "I hope you understand that this is still my classroom," she said, her voice clipped. Nathan studied her, then gave a slow nod. "I know." And with that, he walked out. As he stepped into the hallway, Tyler caught up to him, grinning. "Bro, what was that?" he said, shaking his head. "You just flipped everything upside down." Nathan let out a slow breath, feeling lighter than he had in a long time. "Yeah," he said. And for the first time, he believed it. The air felt different as Nathan Carter stepped out of the classroom that afternoon. The usual noise of students chatting, lockers slamming shut, and sneakers scuffing against the tiled floors filled the hallway, but for him, everything felt just a little bit lighter. For the first time all year, he wasn't walking out of class feeling invisible. Tyler Matthews fell into step beside him, shaking his head with a grin. "Man," he said, still sounding half in disbelief. "I don't know what you did back there, but that was something else." Nathan smirked. Yeah, Tyler nodded. "I mean, Mrs. Simmons looked like she saw a ghost. And the way you played, dude, you've been holding out on us." Nathan shrugged, adjusting the strap of his backpack. "Guess so." When he reached the cafeteria, something else unusual happened. Students who had never spoken to him before were looking at him differently. Emma Collins, who always kept to herself, slid into the seat across from him at lunch. "That was amazing," she said simply, shaking her head. "Seriously? How long have you been playing?" Nathan hesitated for only a second before answering. "Since I was 5. She blinked. "Wow. And you never said anything?" Nathan just smiled. "Not really my style." Across the room, sitting at a table near the teacher's lounge, Mrs. Simmons walked past with her lunch tray. Their eyes met briefly, just for a second. This time, she was the one who looked away first. Nathan didn't react. He just kept eating, because he had already said everything he needed to say. That day in class had changed something, not just for him, but for everyone. The students saw her differently now. They saw him differently too. And Mrs. Simmons? Maybe she would never say it out loud. Maybe she would never fully admit to what she had done, to what she had assumed about him before. But it didn't matter. Because Nathan knew. He knew that when people try to silence you, when they try to underestimate you, the best thing you can do is let your talent speak louder than their doubts. And when you do, they'll have no choice but to listen. Nathan's story is a reminder that sometimes, the most powerful response to doubt and underestimation isn't anger, it's excellence. When people expect you to fail, the best thing you can do is prove them wrong, not with words, but with action. Life is full of moments where we are judged before we even get a chance to show who we truly are. Whether it's because of our background, our abilities, or simply because others don't take the time to see us for who we are, the feeling of being overlooked is universal. But Nathan teaches us an important lesson. Your talent, your passion, your voice, those are things no one can take away from you. For those who have lived through decades of challenges, moments of being underestimated or dismissed, this story is a reminder that dignity and self-worth are never defined by the opinions of others. Stand firm in who you are. Let your skills and your character do the talking. And when the time comes, make sure they remember you, not for what they assumed about you, but for what you truly are. Because in the end, people may try to silence you, but if you make yourself heard, they'll have no choice but to listen.